Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. David Subith wrote in and he asked if I'd ever done a show about this mystery from 1937. I looked back at the archives and I found that I had not. A lot has been written about Amelia Earhart. Tons of books and documentaries have been out in the last 86 years. People have announced they've solved this case, only to be shot down by other researchers who claim they solved it. Bones have been found and studied and lost. Plane wreckage has been examined. A lot of it has been lost as well. It kind of makes you wonder, are the people doing the research really that bad with hanging on to things? Or is there somebody out there trying to keep this mystery a mystery? People who were in the area in 1937 through the end of the war said they saw Amelia Earhart in various places. Witness testimony is good enough to get a murder conviction, but for some odd reason it's not good enough for the naysayers when it comes to people disappearing. It's almost as if they want to believe that the simple idea of a plane crashing and two people dying that way is more acceptable than some of the other thoughts. Amelia Earhart was born in Atchison, Kansas, July 24th, 1897. I'm starting the show off with tongue difficulties. Well, at least all the cats are out of the room. They're all in the kitchen tearing up the place, and hopefully they won't make too much noise or break anything valuable. Let's get back to the show. Okay, she was born in Atchison, Kansas. She defied traditional concepts of what women should be like back then. She did things like she played basketball and she took auto repair classes. She even went to college, which, for women back then, that was unheard of. Women aren't supposed to use their brains. They were supposed to work in the kitchen and have babies, and that was it. Back then, there was something called the woman's place, which was in the home. In 1897, William McKinley was president of the United States. The Klondike Gold Rush had just begun in Alaska. If you listened in last week, you'll know the mysterious airship crash in Aurora, Texas was the same year that Amelia Earhart was born. The following year, the battleship USS Maine exploded in the harbor of Havana, Cuba, a mystery event that led to the United States going to war with Spain. Turns out later investigation showed that the boiler blew up. The Spanish military had nothing to do with it, so that whole war was, well, it was fought for other reasons, I think, other than the Maine. Amelia Earhart was not going to stay in a woman's place. She did things that she thought any woman should be able to do. After graduating from high school, Amelia joined the Ogantz School in Rydell, Pennsylvania. During Christmas vacation in 1917, she went to Toronto in Canada to visit her younger sister Muriel, who was studying up there. World War I was going on, and Amelia was affected by the sight of hundreds of wounded soldiers coming back to the country. She decided to drop out of college and instead took training as a nurse's aide from the Red Cross. Earhart worked as a nurse's aide at the Spadina Military Hospital in Toronto as part of the Voluntary Aid Detachment, the VAD program. She was engaged in arduous nursing duties, and she fell ill herself, suffering from pneumonia and maxillary sinusitis. That's an infection of the sinuses. Though she recovered, that looked like I was saying she was crazy, didn't it? No, it's a sinus infection, which will make you act crazy if you've ever had one. Though she recovered after 2 months, her sinuses were significantly affected after this, and when she would fly, it had some kind of strange effects. If you've ever gone up in an airplane when your sinuses were backed up, you'll know what we're talking about. Well, Earhart began to spend time sitting out at the runway watching pilots in the Royal Flying Corps as they would train at the local airfield. This was back when flying was considered quite a mystery, and if you had a chance, you would watch planes landing and taking off. When I was young, they used to build observation decks at airports, and folks would go watch planes coming and going. This was considered quite the thing back then. And now you can't even get near most airports without going through all kinds of security, and then you got to pay just to park. After the war, Amelia returned to the United States and enrolled at Columbia University in New York as a pre-med student. Earhart took her first airplane ride in California December 1920, and from that moment on, her life took a new direction. January 1921, she started flying lessons with a female flight instructor named Netta Snook. To help pay for these lessons, Earhart worked as a filing clerk at a Los Angeles telephone company. Later that year, she purchased her first airplane, a second-hand Keener Airster. She nicknamed the plane the Canary because it was bright yellow. Mary Anita Southern, better known as Netta Snook, or Snooky, was a pioneer aviator who achieved a long list of firsts. She was the first woman aviator in Iowa, a first woman student accepted at the Curtis Flying School in Virginia, first woman aviator to run her own aviation business, and first woman to run a commercial airfield. Her autobiography, I Taught Amelia to Fly, captures the essence of her fame, and she is linked to Earhart as being her very first instructor. Earhart passed her flight test in December 1921, earning a National Aeronautics Association license. 2 days later, she participated in her first flight exhibition at the Sierra Aerodrome in Pasadena, California. Earhart set a number of aviation records in her short career. Her first record came 1922 when she became the first woman to fly solo above 1,400 feet. This was another one of those strange things that the boys in the white lab coats used to tell people. If you flew too high, it would kill you, not because of the lack of oxygen, but because you're so far from the ground. They had some weird ideas back then. Oh yes, and women flying that hard, well, it would have weird effects on their lady parts. In 1932, Earhart became the first woman and second person, after Charles Lindbergh, to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. She left Newfoundland, Canada, May 20th in a red Lockheed Vega 5B and arrived a day later, landing in a cow field near Londonderry, Northern Ireland. Upon returning to the United States, Congress awarded her the Distinguished Flying Cross, a military decoration awarded for heroism or extraordinary achievements while participating in an aerial flight. She was the first woman to receive this honor. Later that year, Earhart made the first solo non-stop flight across the United States by a woman. She started in Los Angeles and landed 19 hours later in Newark, New Jersey. She also became the first person to fly solo from Hawaii to the United States mainland in 1935. Earhart consistently worked to promote opportunities for women in aviation. In 1929, after placing third in the all-women's air derby, the first transcontinental air race for women, Earhart helped to form the 99s, an international organization for the advancement of female pilots. She became the first president of this organization of licensed pilots, which is still around today. It has women from 44 different countries in it. June 1st, 1937, Amelia Earhart took off from Oakland, California, on an eastbound flight around the world. It was her second attempt to become the first pilot ever to circumnavigate the planet. Fred Noonan was her navigator. Fred was born in Cook County, Illinois, 1893. At the age of 17, Noonan had shipped out of Seattle as an ordinary seaman on a British sailing bark called the Crompton. Between 1910 and 1915, Noonan worked on over a dozen ships, rising to the ratings of quartermaster and bosun's mate. He continued working on merchant ships through World War I, serving as an officer on an ammunition ship. His wartime service included being on 3 different vessels that were all sunk by U-boats. Can you imagine getting torpedoed 3 times and surviving? Right up there with Violet Jessup. After the war, Noonan continued in the Merchant Marines and achieved a measure of prominence as a ship's officer. Following a 22-year career at sea, Noonan decided on a new career direction. He received a commercial pilot's license in 1930. In the following year, he was awarded a Class Master, any ocean, in qualification of merchant ship's captain. He worked for Pan American World Airways as a navigation instructor in Miami and an airport manager in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, eventually becoming the inspector for all of the company's airports. March 1935, Noonan was the navigator on the first Pan Am Clipper at San Francisco Bay. In April, he navigated the historic round-trip China Clipper flight between San Francisco and Honolulu. I wonder why they call it the China Clipper if they only went to Hawaii. That was the name of the plane. Noonan was subsequently responsible for mapping Pan America's Clipper routes from the Pacific Ocean, participating in many flights to Midway Island, Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, and Hong Kong. In addition to more modern navigational tools, Noonan, being a licensed ship's captain, was known for carrying a ship's sextants on all of his flights. A lot of folks out there like to say that Fred was a drunk. They claim he was an alcoholic. They will say he drank all the time, and he was probably drunk, and that's why him and Earhart crashed at sea. They just love laying the blame on somebody who can't defend themselves. Well, the first time that anybody made reference to Fred Noonan being a drunk was in 1966, when somebody was trying to sell their book. Now, somebody else had solved the Earhart mystery, and they put it down in black and white. The writer claimed that Noonan had been arrested in Knoxville with a DUI. Well, there's absolutely no report of Fred Noonan ever having been arrested for drinking, never having been in a vehicle accident, nothing along those lines. I think it was just made up by somebody trying to sell a book. Unfortunately, if you ask most people today, they'll tell you that Fred Noonan was an alcoholic, and that's why they didn't make it to Howland Island. It's amazing what some bad press can do for a person's history. Earhart was piloting a twin-engine Lockheed 10E Electra and was accompanied on the flight by navigator Fred Noonan. The navigation equipment was situated in the rear of the plane. Now, this was probably because there wasn't room in the cockpit for all of his gear. They flew to Miami and then down to South America, across the Atlantic to Africa, and then east to India and Southeast Asia. The pair reached Lae, New Guinea, June 29th. By this time, they had already flown 22,000 miles. They only had 7,000 to go. Earhart and Noonan deported Lae for Howland Island, their next refueling stop, June 2nd. She and Noonan lost radio contact with the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca, which was anchored off of the coast of Howland Island to help guide them in. Howland Island was 450 acres of uninhabited land situated pretty much in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific Ocean, almost halfway between Hawaii and Australia. It is mostly known by sailors as a navigational hazard. It may have once been populated by Polynesian folks, but they packed their bags and left a long time ago. The United States acquired the island in 1856 as a part of the country's guano harvesting project. Mid-1930s, land was cleared as a landing strip intended to be used as a midway point in transatlantic air flights, trans-Pacific air flights, but it was never used. Guano is an extremely beneficial fertilizer. It comes from seabirds and bats. It's excrement. It's what they do after they eat. That was all the island was good for, was for birds to poop on it, and then people would go collect it, up until Earhart was going to use it as a landing and refueling site. Now, her flight was a private venture. It was not being sponsored by the government. It wasn't being paid for by the government. At least that's what they tell us. So why did the United States government go to such expenses to help out? They even built a small lighthouse at the same time that they were improving the runways for her plane. Now, keep in mind, there was no other reason to land on that island other than for her and Noonan to stop and get gassed. Not gassed as in drunk. They were specifically being modified for her and her airplane. As the pair were preparing to leave New Guinea and fly to Howland, they lightened their plane a bit. They took out anything that they considered unnecessary so they could lighten the load and get better fuel mileage. They removed one of their radio antenna. You'd think something else could have been taken out instead, say a pair of boots or something like that, instead of something slightly vital like a radio antenna. Uh, it's just about the most important thing you've got besides fuel, I would think. They also removed a radio. They had more than one. They removed the key-type radio, the one that used Morse code, because neither Noonan nor Earhart knew how to use it. It had been put in the plane by somebody that didn't realize that nobody on board could use a teletype, not a teletype, a key type. So Amelia Earhart decided that they would remove the telegraph code key transmitter from her plane. She considered it to be just dead weight, which, seeing as nobody could use it, well, it might have been useful. Anyway, before departing, they also dropped a trailing antenna that would have allowed her to use the 500 kilocycle marine frequency. Now let's see, she's flying towards an island where there's a ship parked that's going to guide her in, and that ship is more than likely going to be using a marine frequency? Oh well. Instead of Morse code, Earhart planned to communicate by voice using a higher bandwidth. While Earhart's plane was in the air, the Coast Guard cutter Itasca was waiting to guide her to Howland. Jean Vidal, a friend of Earhart's, was no longer working at the Bureau of Air Commerce, and it had been his job to coordinate things between Earhart's plane and the Coast Guard. So now there was nobody right there on top of things saying, this is what we need from y'all. There were other difficulties. A radio direction finder on Howland Island that would work with Earhart's high bandwidth equipment required batteries. They were drained almost dead before she was even close to the island. And the ship's direction finder only operated at a lower bandwidth. When all the arrangements were being made before takeoff, it wasn't as if Earhart was actually talking to the Coast Guard. Somebody said that they would talk to somebody else and see to it that somebody else along the route was going to be there just in case things went south. Earhart had asked for weather forecasts from Howland Island. The Itasca didn't have a meteorologist on board, so they had to ask Hawaii to send them the forecasts. They were 1,700 miles away from Hawaii. Right up until the last day, there were still questions as to which frequencies were going to be used, and if Earhart would use voice or key-type transmissions. Even though they had removed the key type from the plane, the folks in the Coast Guard didn't know that either. 14 hours and 15 minutes into her flight, the Itasca received the first somewhat garbled transmission from Earhart, being in cloudy weather. The messages themselves would grow clearer. Their content remained somewhat worrying, as when Earhart radioed saying that we are circling but cannot see island and cannot hear you. She apparently only received one message from the ship, though the Itasca had been transmitting 4 hours. Maybe it had something to do with that missing antenna. While continuing to broadcast, the radio strength of her communications indicated that she was close, but she couldn't hear from the Itasca. Earhart remained unable to see Howland Island as well. The weather around Howland was clear, but there were clouds about 30 miles northwest. If Earhart had flown into the clouds and bad weather along the way, it could have prevented Noonan from taking sightings that he needed in order to navigate precisely. Let's add a little more mystery to this. The charts that Noonan had been issued, they weren't accurate. They were several miles off. Earhart's last transmission was made 20 hours and 14 minutes into her flight, indicating that they were going to continue flying north and then south. The plane never arrived at Howland. President Roosevelt authorized a massive 2 weeks search for the pair, but they were never found. July 19, 1937, Earhart and Noonan were declared lost at sea. The official position from the U.S. government is that Earhart and Noonan crashed into the Pacific Ocean, but there are numerous theories that say elsewise. The U.S. Coast Guard had been in sporadic radio contact with Earhart, receiving messages that she was lost and running low on fuel. In the week that followed, another 57 credible distress messages were heard at locations all around the world. People swore that they had been in contact with Amelia Earhart weeks after the Coast Guard had said that her plane was no longer in the air. Had they managed to land on an uninhabited island, the radio would still work as long as the batteries were charged. She could have been sitting on an island somewhere, transmitting out into the atmosphere, hoping that somebody could hear her. But remember, she's broadcasting at a high frequency, and the Coast Guard is operating on a low frequency. Looking at the situation in the light of today, people might wonder why the Coast Guard didn't try to focus on these radio messages. Some signals can bounce off the upper atmosphere and come down on the other side of the planet. Since the Coast Guard was using different radio frequencies, they could have been practically miles from Earhart and Noonan and never heard a word from them. What we have here is a failure to communicate. Some of you all get that. The radio logs from the Itasca are anything but clear. It's not like somebody listened to the radio and wrote out word for word what was being said. The radio operators used shorthand to write out what was being said. They have to, well, you and I have to take their word for whether or not they were actually even communicating with Earhart or not. 18 months later, Earhart was declared legally dead. Nobody knows for certain what happened to her, or Noonan. The most generally accepted theory is that Earhart had trouble spotting the island where she and Noonan were supposed to land. They ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean. The problem with that theory is it doesn't take into account the messages that were being heard for weeks afterwards. One was heard July 7th by a woman using a shortwave radio in Canada. The person heard on the radio said that they were Amelia Earhart. Could this have been somebody scamming other people? Maybe, but that just wasn't the thing to do back then. If you were caught pretending to be somebody who was in distress back then, well, people would probably drag you out of your home, lynch you, and set your house on fire. You didn't do things like that back then. Nowadays, it's a common practice. The International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, better known as TIGHAR, published a report in 2018 saying that Earhart had landed not on Howland Island, but on another remote uninhabited island in Central Pacific named Gardner Island. Nowadays they call it Nicomaroro. She and Noonan passed away eventually there on the island all by themselves. This theory has gained ground in recent years due to the discovery on Nicomaroro of artifacts that could be related to Earhart, including an empty jar of skin cream that Earhart was known to use, some bones that may or may not have been identified as a woman of around Earhart's height, and a piece of plexiglass that is similar to what was used on the Lockheed electric airplane that Earhart had been flying. In 2018, a scientific study published in Forensic Anthropology claimed that a set of bones found on the island of Nicomaroro, man, that is a hard name to say, in 1940 belonged to Earhart, despite previous conducted research that concluded the remains belonged to some guy from European descent, some man. Decades before the study was published, a theory that Earhart crashed her plane and subsequently died as a castaway on the island was largely just being put out there by one man, University of Tennessee professor Richard Jantz, up until that latest study. While this particular theory might have been easily refuted prior to the release of the study, Jantz concluded that the bones were more similar to the Nicomaroro bones than 99% of individuals in the reference sample, which he says proves that the most compelling evidence discovered that credibly points to Earhart finally having been found. Now this theory is also supported by another scientist, including Rick Gillespie, director of TIGHAR, who claims that the island's close vicinity to Earhart's flight path only further supports it. They don't have much proof today because they lost the bones as well. Boy, people sure lose a lot of important things, kind of like those cigarette butts from the D.B. Cooper plane. Oh, we'll just put them in this drawer over here. We don't need things. Keep losing evidence. In his book, Amelia Earhart, Beyond the Grave, W.C. Jameson claims that Earhart was actually a spy who had been recruited by President Roosevelt to take aerial photographs of Japanese military installations in the Pacific. Under this theory, the Japanese shot the plane down, and then they took Earhart and Noonan captive. The 20th century was a somewhat turbulent time in Japan, as the country bounced between heights of power and wealth and the depths of poverty and devastation. After the dramatic effects to modernize politically, socially, economically, and culturally during the Meiji Restoration, Japan sought to control neighboring countries. They competed with Western imperialist ambitions. They saw what the United States, Britain, Europe were doing, and they wanted to get in on some of that. Japan participated in World War I, fighting on the side of the Allies. As a reward for being on the winning side, Japan was given control of all German colonies in their area. This gave them some much-needed minerals and textiles, which they used for export. Despite dramatic industrial and financial expansion during the war years, along with the rest of the world, Japan was plunged into an economic crisis in the 20s, which was accompanied by social upheaval, which was caused by stresses of unemployment, an expanding population, and rapid urban growth. Looking around the part of the world not under their control, plans were being made to do something about their situation. Like, if we could just take over that island over there, we'd be in much better shape. If we could just take over that big chunk of mainland, we'd be in much better shape. So, Japan decided they were going to invade China, which they did in 1931. They bumped heads with Russia, leading to another war with them. Japan and Russia have been fighting each other for a long time. Japan had signed a treaty with Germany in 1937, saying that they would support each other in a time of war. Then, Germany signed a treaty with Russia in 1939, who were currently fighting Japan, who were now an ally of Germany. Japan felt as if Hitler was stabbing them in the back, siding with Russia. Meanwhile, Chamberlain from Britain was running around waving a piece of paper in the air yelling, "Peace in our time." And people believed him. I might not be the brightest bulb in the box, but I know treaties aren't worth the paper that they're written on. Yet, people even today jump up and down every time two world leaders sit down and scribble their names on a piece of paper, swearing that they're not going to try and kill everybody on the planet. Total waste of ink. And yet, today, people are still all excited. Oh, look, they signed a peace treaty. Just ask the Indians about treaties. Feather, not dot. There were no spy satellites back then. If you wanted intel, you had to either sail to the country, get out, walk around and have a look, or you had to fly, and you had to be close enough to be able to fly there and back. Twin-engine planes could usually make about 800 to 1,000 miles nonstop. Fuel was their biggest problem. The folks in Washington were aware of Japan's intentions of taking over more of that part of the world. It was difficult to get details of things like how many ships their navy had, or were they building landing fields on various islands. If you asked them, they would simply say, no, we're not doing anything like that. Who are you going to believe? One theory about her disappearance is that Earhart had been recruited to spy on Japan and its possessions. Her flight plan was to take her along the southern coast of Burma, Thailand, Indonesia, and then over to New Guinea. Nowhere near Japan or any of her colonies. Well, this was what people were being told. She could have flown north from New Guinea to scout out any activity in, say, the Philippines, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and other islands that the Japanese would have to occupy if they wanted to invade, say, Australia, which they did want to. Her Electra had been equipped with several extra fuel tanks, which gave her a distance of about 4,500 miles. From New Guinea to Howland Island is 2,764 miles. That would give her 1,700 miles of spying, if that's what she was there for. She was friends with Roosevelt, and she had met with him several times before her trip. What could possibly go wrong? Just have your navigator hang out the back window with a camera and click a few pictures of the islands as you pass over them. Japan was still considered to be our ally at that time. That's why they wanted to spy on them. You've heard the saying, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. Let's just pretend for a bit that the real reason for Earhart's flight was to spy on Japan. To make it appear as if she were somewhere else, the Itasca could have been broadcasting messages never intended to be heard by Earhart or Noonan, but they would have been heard by the Japanese. In the lead up to World War II, Hitler would give lots of speeches. The British would listen in since everything was being sent out over the airwaves. Hitler would speak in Berlin, and then a few minutes later, he might be speaking in Munich, 364 miles away. The Brits were at wits' end trying to figure out how he got around so fast. They were thinking they had some kind of a new super train or something running through Germany, because he was making speeches from all over the country, just minutes apart. It wasn't until the end of the war that the British discovered the Germans had made huge advances, not in transportation, but in recording. The radio speeches being heard were actually recordings that had been made in advance. The intel boys thought that Hitler was some kind of a wow transportation when he really had some kind of a wow recorder. Well, the war wasn't on yet, but Japan had already invaded China, Korea, Taiwan, and parts of Mongolia. In order to continue working their way south, the Japanese Navy would have to be amassing ships and supplies on their southern extremities. Witnesses have been found who swear they saw a twin-engine silver plane being transported on a Japanese ship. When asked to identify pictures, they all picked out an Electra. The pilot was a woman who they said dressed like a man, and there was another man with her. There is an 80-year-old photo showing what may have been Earhart and Noonan surrounded by a group of people on a dock at Jalut Atoll in the Marshall Islands that was taken in 1937. There are quite a few older residents of the islands who talk about seeing or hearing about two Americans who were being held by the Japanese, one of whom was a woman who had short hair and dressed like a man. Back then, it was considered really wrong for women to dress in pants and have short hair. Women's pants were made with a zipper on the side instead of in the middle, so that way you knew that those were women's pants and not men's. In Japan, this was just short of heresy. Women weren't even considered citizens at that time. They were more like possessions. How dare this woman try to live life as a man? Any Japanese soldier would have found themselves in a bit of a quandary. You catch two spies, one of whom is not behaving in a proper womanly manner. The U.S. is still acting as if there is friendship and good feelings between the two countries. Japan had attended the United States 1921 Navy versus Army test to see if a bomber could sink a battleship. The Japanese went home with a lot more information than the U.S. military took home. The smart thing to do was to push the captives off on some higher up and let them deal with it. The story of Earhart and Noonan in the Marshall Islands gets mixed up a bit from here due to some of the witness testimony. Some say they heard that the two Americans were held prisoner for several months and then they were both executed. Their bodies went into a mass grave along with all the people who had been worked to death by the Japanese soldiers. An 11-year-old girl was taking a shortcut through a sugarcane field. She hid when she heard Japanese motorcycles approaching, and she noticed that they had stopped near where she was hiding. The soldiers had a woman sitting in the sidecar who had a blindfold on, and she had short hair as well. The men took the woman to an already dug grave, and the girl said she heard a shot. Others say the two were placed aboard a ship and taken to Japan. Once there, they were held as prisoners until the end of the war. From there, they either had died from disease or been executed. Earhart's plane was found by the U.S. military on Saipan on the Mariana Islands, but it was hidden away so as to not cause any embarrassment to the Roosevelts or to President Roosevelt or his administration. When contacted by the Japanese government regarding Earhart, President Roosevelt had disavowed all knowledge of her and Noonan and had let the Japanese deal with them as they would. To avoid letting the Japanese know that they were being investigated by the U.S. and avoid any backlash from political opponents. Some things never change. This embarrassment had its origins in several sensitive areas of national concern. To publicly acknowledge that Earhart had been captured by the Japanese military in 1937, taken into custody, moved to a secure place of confinement, either with or without the knowledge of the president, would have enormous political implications. Had Roosevelt known and abandoned Earhart because of a lack of political will or military expedience, he would be forever stigmatized as the most cowardly U.S. president. Alternatively, if Roosevelt's military and intelligence organizations had not been aware of Earhart's captivity in the Japanese hands until 1945, he would most certainly bear the brand of a totally incompetent for time on from then. Some would want to know why he had chosen to spy on one of our allies, which could have led to another war. In 1943, an Australian Army corporal said an aircraft engine with a Pratt & Whitney serial number was found on the New Britain island. The researchers have said it would have been impossible for Earhart and Noonan to make the 2,000-mile journey from Howland Island, where the pair sent out radio transmissions detailing their lack of fuel. That is, unless they had never gotten close to Howland. The U.S. Navy crew member in the World War II said he had seen a photograph of 4 people. He clearly identified Earhart in the photograph belonging to a local man on Imaru Island just off Papua New Guinea. Earhart was seen to have been posing with a Japanese military officer, a missionary, and a young boy. From the way that Earhart appeared in the photo, the crew member must have assumed that she was being held captive by the Japanese military. After the crew member reported this sighting, the photograph was never seen again. In another theory involving Japanese capture, Earhart was forced to spread Japanese propaganda over the radio. Japan rounded up any English-speaking women and had them read propaganda over the radio. All of these women were collectively named Tokyo Rose. Once she was liberated by the United States military, in order to avoid embarrassment about being a shill for the Japanese forces, Earhart changed her name and returned to the U.S. pretending to be a different person. Earhart is supposed to have become Irene Bolam, living in New Jersey, and she died at 86 in 1982. In a 1943 movie called Flight for Freedom, the hero is a female pilot who disappears while flying over Japan on a spy mission. The story is said to have been the real account of Earhart and her disappearance. Iva Taguri was an American citizen. She went to take care of her sick aunt, who was living in Japan, just weeks before Pearl Harbor. Once war was declared, she couldn't get back home. Iva wound up working at a radio station and soon became one of the many women broadcasting propaganda for the Japanese military, all of whom were being called Tokyo Rose. Once she got back to the United States, Iva was thrown into prison. She was not the only one forced to do the radio shows. She was just the only one prosecuted. Most U.S. servicemen who listened to her on the radio said it was almost sounded as if she were trying to help the U.S. Far more than she was doing any good for the Japanese. Some of her broadcasts served as more of a warning of where the Japanese Navy might be hiding. In 1974, investigative journalists found that important witnesses had asserted that they had been forced to lie during their testimony. They stated that the FBI and the U.S. Occupation Police had coerced them for more than 2 months about what they should say on the stand, and that they had been threatened with treason themselves if they did not cooperate. Why was the FBI in such a huge hurry to prosecute one young U.S. citizen? Makes you wonder. Had Earhart been broadcasting propaganda for Japan, would she have faced a similar, less than welcome return home? There were something like 75 prisoners from England and the United States and a few other countries who all worked at Radio Tokyo. None of them ever said there was a woman who dressed like a man with short hair in their group. Another slant to this idea is Earhart was tired of being a celebrity, which is kind of true. She didn't really like all those cameras in her face and all those interviews, but she went along with it for other reasons. She just wanted to be a normal person with a normal life. Either at the end of the war or shortly after takeoff, Earhart decided she was going to fake her own death and return to the United States under a new identity. If this were the case, what happened to her navigator? He would also have to agree to change his name and leave his wife and take up a new identity. If he refused, well, this would leave a bit of a problem for Earhart. Earhart would have to do one of two things. Either she would have to kill him, which I don't think she would do, or she would somehow have to make him agree to never spill the beans about what she tried to get him to do. The idea of Earhart coming back under a new name is plausible, but only after having been held by the Japanese government. I don't think this would have happened while they were flying. Another theory being bandied about is Earhart and Noonan decided to disappear together and live happily ever after somewhere in the world. Earhart had been married to George Putnam for 6 years. Noonan was on his second wife, who he had only just married. Being stuck together in that airplane for the entire flight, the two are said to have grown closer to each other than their own spouses, and they decided they were going to fake their deaths so they could go off and live together. If this were the case, where did they decide to go as the plane was approaching Howland Island? They could have turned south and flown to Australia. Noonan could have plotted a course into the vast wilderness of Australia. Earhart could have found a nice open stretch to land on. And then what? They would have to find some place to live. They couldn't just set up camp in the back of the airplane for the rest of their lives. Well, or could they? Love makes people do crazy things. Once in Australia had entered the war, people would look at Noonan and wonder why this healthy man wasn't serving in the forces. He would have been under a microscope, and he would soon have been pointed out as being a possible spy, which would lead to an investigation, which would lead to his true identity being found, etc., etc. July 1927. George Putnam was responsible for the blockbuster publication called We, which was Charles Lindbergh's autobiography account of his non-stop transatlantic flight from New York to Paris in May of that year. Putnam's wife, Dorothy Biney, had traveled to South America and began a well-chronicled affair with George Weymouth, a man who was 19 years younger than her. In 1928, Putnam was contacted. In 1928, Putnam was contacted by Mary Phipps Guest, who suggested he should write a book about a female pilot who could fly solo across the Atlantic as well. All they needed was to find a female pilot and then get her to fly across the Atlantic. It hadn't happened yet. In fact, nobody was even planning it yet. But this woman wanted it to happen. A Guest asked Putnam to find a suitable candidate and then convince this female pilot that that is what she should do. Well, he came up with Amelia Earhart, who at that time was unknown. Once Earhart had managed to fly the Atlantic 1932, she wrote a book called 20 Hours and 40 Minutes, which was then published by Putnam. Putnam then got Earhart to endorse products and make public tours to enhance her image. He's the one that kind of forced her to become a public image. She didn't really want anything to do with it. He wanted her to. Well, Earhart's ideas on... eventually they got close and decided to get married. Earhart's ideas on marriage were somewhat different, along with the way she dressed. She believed that both members of a marriage should be equals. It was not a man's world. There was no such thing as the woman's place. She wanted them to both have a 50-50 say in everything, which is the way it really should be, but that's another subject. Not only that, but people began to refer to George Putnam as being Mr. Earhart. Now, I don't know if he agreed to this or he just went along with it, but she wasn't his wife. He was her husband. She was the one everybody was talking about. So, well, anyway, Earhart's ideas were different for the time. Earhart joined the faculty of the Purdue University College of Technology in 1935 as a visiting faculty member, and she would consult women on careers and on technology advances, hopefully to get them into the Department of Aeronautics. In the lead up to the big event, Putnam made the most of his wife's new publicity, as she did speaking engagements all over the country. She signed autographs. She was interviewed by world publications. Earhart became his gravy train. If she had succeeded, George would have gotten a ton of money off her. With her disappearing, he made a ton of money off of her. The only thing that would have not made money is if his wife had woke up one morning and said that she couldn't fly anymore, or she had decided it was just too dangerous to fly around the world. Had that happened, well, that would have been the end of Putnam's gravy train. He would have been left out in the cold. I see no reason for Putnam to have wanted his wife to not make it on the flight. In fact, it was going to be worth a lot more money had she made it. He stood to benefit far more by her success than by her failure. If you think Earhart and Noonan might have been spying on the New Schwabenland, well, the Nazi base in Antarctica, it's at the bottom of the Atlantic, and Earhart disappeared over the Pacific. That and the fact that New Schwabenland hadn't been established until 1939, 2 years after she disappeared. Now, that's not saying that the Nazis couldn't have had something to do with her disappearance. It just wasn't our Antarctic base. Seeing as Earhart and Noonan disappeared without a trace, some folks turned to saying they'd been abducted by aliens. The area in the South Pacific where Earhart, Noonan, and their plane disappeared is a hotbed of UFO activity. If you look at most alien abduction stories, the victims are usually returned in a few hours. Well, except for Travis Walton, who was kept for several days. Have you ever heard of the 10 and back stories? Aliens abduct someone, and they use them as slave labor for 10 years. Oh, I'm sorry, it's 20 and back. They used them for slave labor for about 20 years. Once their sentence was finished, the prisoner would be returned to moments from when they were abducted. The usual term of slavery was said to be 20 years. Through some form of advanced technology, the victims' lives would be turned into, 20 years would be turned into about an hour. Their mind would be completely wiped, so they wouldn't have any memory of what happened. Well, hopefully they wouldn't have any memory. They would wake up in the morning as if they'd just had a very strange dream. I doubt Earhart and Noonan could have been lumped into this category. We don't know what some aliens might do with us. Something to keep in mind the next time you see a bunch of grays in your bedroom. If you ever do wake up in the morning with some strange dream where you feel as if you were a slave laborer on some alien ship for a very long period of time, you might want to look into the 20 and back episodes from The Confessionals with Tony Merkel. There are hundreds of thousands of people who vanish each year who are never seen or heard from again. The only way to prove this theory is if Earhart pops back into our world, and then she can prove that she's Earhart. Now, this would make for some interesting listening. It would be far better than Ann Anderson, who had been alive as Anastasia. Now, a lot of people didn't believe that she was her, but, well, the Romanovs went out of their way to deny that this was her, since there were millions of dollars in the balance. Personally, I think Ann Anderson was Anastasia, but that's just me being a me. Some have said that Earhart and Noonan were abducted by a race of people living in the center of the earth. According to the New Dimensions blog, a site dedicated to the theory that a group of ancient beings from Atlantis and other ancient civilizations have created a secret society in the middle of the earth. They call this the Hollow Earth theory. Earhart, despite the fact that she would be 122 years old today, is said to be still living in this place and that she still looks the same as when she disappeared. They say, this Hollow Earth group say, that just seconds before her plane crashed into the ocean, they transported her by teleporting her into the Hollow Earth. Now, they don't say if Noonan was allowed to come along or not. Maybe they didn't like him. Nearly a century later, they say that Earhart is still young and that she is there to greet new arrivals to the Hollow Earth. If any of y'all ever make it down there, would you give me a holler? Send me a message and let me know if it's true or not. Another possibility is that a portal might have popped open and they accidentally flew into it. Now, you've heard people talk about what they call skyquakes, or that trumpeting sound heard up in the sky. There is a theory going around that these sounds are being made as a portal opens or closes. It's the ripping of the atmosphere that is causing these strange sounds that people are hearing. Some of the recordings I've heard sound like metal being scraped across concrete, like somebody's dragging a bulldozer blade back and forth. I don't want to use this, but in the movie Jumanji, Welcome to the Jungle, anytime one of the gang is killed and then they brought back to life, and you hear that sound up in the sky and then they fall back down, that's kind of what they were talking about here. The sky opens up, something comes through, and then it closes again. And that's what that weird noise is that people are hearing. Had Earhart and Noonan flown into a portal, when and where would they reappear? Or did they simply pass into another dimension? This part of the ocean is littered with wrecks of airplanes from World War II. Even if the plane is ever found, we might never know what actually happened to the two travelers. Plus, have other planes flown into portals as well, only to vanish without a trace? Just try thinking about how many reports you know where a plane has disappeared, never to be found again. It is worth mentioning that there is very little evidence that Earhart ever actually survived the war. The idea that she was found by the Japanese is plausible. It's believable. The fact that she was taken to Saipan is even more so believable because there are so many witnesses there who all say either they saw her or they know somebody who did. We're not talking one or two people, we're talking dozens. We're talking people that had no reason to lie. They're being interviewed about what they saw the Japanese doing during the war, and they say, oh, yeah, by the way, they brought this woman who we thought was a man because the way she dressed, and she had another guy with her, and then the Japanese killed them both and buried them out there in a sugar plantation somewhere. There are so many theories as to what happened to Earhart and Noonan, it's almost impossible to go over all of them in just an hour. So, this is what we know. Earhart and Noonan were flying around the world, and they vanished somewhere on the South Pacific. Other than that, there's really no way of saying for sure what happened to them. That young girl didn't actually see Earhart being killed, but she did see somebody who looked like Earhart, and she did hear a gunshot, which led a lot of people to believe that that's what happened. Then there's all the people that said that they saw Earhart being loaded on a ship that was being sent to Japan, and she was never seen again after that. So, what happened to Earhart and Noonan? We may never know. It's one of those things that as long as the story is still being talked about, her and her navigator are almost still alive. They're still alive in our memories. They're still alive as people talk about them over and over, trying to figure out what happened in 1937. The two adventurers found themselves as pawns in a chessboard of world domination. As for the truth, we may never know. The truth is controlled by people who want to keep the rest of us in the dark. What could possibly be gained by finding out something that happened 86 years ago? All the time and money that is being used looking into this? Well, like I said, the story is being kept alive, and her memory is being kept alive as long as people keep looking for her. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, let other people know. I'm going to borrow this from Tony Merkel. Share the show. I don't care how you share it, but share it. That's what Tony says at the end of every episode. If you want to buy a book or a t-shirt or a coffee cup, you can find my books at Amazon.com. And if you want a t-shirt or a coffee cup, go to TeePublic. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, the same murder three? Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.